So as I said in the last video, really three components to your participation in lab. One is the planning of the lab report, and as we said, I'll be able to see the history of the chats in your Discord group, so I'll know whether you're involved in planning. You want to make sure you take a significant role in that if you don't want to have a point deduction for not being involved in the planning of the lab experiment. Oops. There's also carrying out lab experiments in person during the open labs, and we are going to have a sign-in sheet there. So any open lab session that you come to attend, you'll sign in. So we'll have a record that you attended that and participated in the in-person, hands-on laboratory experiments. That's also part of the experience and part of your participation when it comes to lab. And then writing the lab report is another key component to that, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But any lab data that anyone in your group collects, you want to make sure you record it in your lab notebook. So there's a little bit of a section here about lab notebooks. You want to have a lot of detail in there because later when you go to write the lab report, you're going to have your data already in your lab notebook described so that you can read through that and recognize the important points about what happened, the data you collected, what it means, how you would interpret it, and then you can use that to help you write the lab report. It's very difficult to write the lab report if you don't have a good, thorough lab notebook. One other thing I want to really emphasize here is make sure if anyone in your group collects data in lab that they share it with you, because there may be students who end up dropping the course or switching lab groups, and it might be difficult to contact them and get the data from them that you need to write a lab report, especially if they drop the class. So you want to make sure as soon as they collect, or anyone in your group collects data, that it's shared with everyone so everyone can record it in their own lab notebook. That way, if you have to write a lab report on your own, you can do that without having to try to contact someone who might not be very responsive. That surprisingly kind of happens fairly often, actually. If you've not contributed to the planning of the lab experiment, as well as collecting data and writing the lab report, you're going to have a point deduction because we have ways of determining who's involved in all of that. So then to earn those points in lab, you have to write a lab report. The lab reports don't have to be especially long, but they do have to address a few important details, a lot of important details about the lab experiment that you carried out. So the lab report guidelines are here. There's a few sections we're looking for. The proposal or approach section and the conclusion section are usually the biggest sections. That's where I'm looking for you to explain why you did what you did, how you carried things out, and why. Full explanations for why the experiments were run the way they were in every detail that's involved in that. I'm looking for a lot of detail associated with why and how you set up the lab experiments, as well as how you're interpreting the lab data. What conclusions can you make from the lab data? What errors might you have made? What might you have done differently? So make sure there's a lot of detail here. Read through the section before you go to write the lab report so you know you're including everything I'm looking for. And then at the end of the lab report, this is a really important part. You definitely want to make sure your name is on the top of the lab report if you want to get credit for it. As we said earlier in a different video, the history of your Google document is, I can access that once you share the document with me. So I'll know which of you contributed in which ways to the writing of the lab report. So make sure you're significantly involved in that along with your other group members so that everyone will contribute in a roughly equal way and everyone will earn full credit for that lab experiment and report with no point deduction. Right? If you're not involved in the planning, carrying out of the lab, or significantly and meaningfully involved in writing the lab report as well, you will experience a point deduction and your lab grade will be lower than the grade your group earns on that particular lab report. So there's a sample lab report you can look at here. So once your group finishes collecting all the data you need, you'll start writing the lab report. Take a week to write the lab report collaboratively with the other people in your group. At the end of a week, make sure that your lab report says, where is that here? So it's right here. It says, once your group has collected all of your data, you have a week to complete a rough draft lab report. And at the top, you want to write ready for comments. You want to be communicating with me as much as possible about the state of your lab report, right? So in the very beginning, you might write lab report not yet ready or something like that. But once you've got your rough draft completed, you follow the lab report suggested guidelines on this syllabus. You want to write ready for comments at the top. When I see that and I look at your Google document, I'll go in, make corrections, suggestions, make a bunch of comments, things for you to add, things for you to change. And then after I do that, you have another week to edit, make edits, address my comments, and fix anything I'm suggesting that you fix. And then when you're completed with addressing all my comments, you'll want to write ready for grading at the top of your Google document. So as long as everyone in your group has significantly contributed to planning the lab experiment, running the experiments, and writing the lab report, and if you addressed all my comments on your rough draft, you should end up with quite a good grade on your final lab report. And that will really help you since the lab makes up 20% of your overall grade.